Hello everyone, welcome to another late night stroll through the stranger corners of history. If you found your way here, it's probably because your mind refuses to sleep. So, let's give it something quietly absurd to chew on. Medieval superstitions that actually worked. Before we dive too deeply, a gentle nudge. If you enjoy stories that let you relax and learn at the same time, consider liking this video and subscribing to History at Bedtime. Also, feel free to leave a comment sharing your location and local time. We like to see history travel the globe alongside our viewers. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. It's the year 1327. The sun has fallen behind the thatched rooftops of a small village somewhere in England. Chickens have gone quiet. The air smells of wood smoke, bread, and damp soil. And in the distance, a single church bell hums, not ringing for mass, but to tell the night it's safe to come out. Inside a cottage, a woman whispers a prayer over her child's bed. There's a charm of iron hanging above the door, a loaf of bread cooling by the hearth, and a pot of herbs steeping near the coals. She's not a scholar, nor a doctor, nor a witch. She's simply a believer in the small things that keep life safe when reason hasn't yet caught up. This was a world before thermometers, before microscopes, before anyone could say why something worked. So when people found patterns, a flower that eased fever, a ritual that seemed to keep the storm away, they didn't call it science. They called it faith, or fear, or magic, and they kept doing it. The strange thing is, sometimes they were right. Tonight, we're going to wander through that world, a place where belief was protection, and every shadow might hide either danger or cure. A time when the human mind tried to reason with the invisible, by giving it shape, by naming it, by creating rituals that made sense of the senseless. You see, superstition wasn't madness, it was memory. It was science in disguise, coded in rhyme and ritual so that even the illiterate could remember it. They whispered it to their children. Never leave bread unbroken at night. Always turn the iron toward the door. And if a storm comes, ring the bells. The sound will frighten the sky back into silence. To us, these sound like poetry or nonsense. To them, they were survival. And the longer you listen, the more you realize the line between superstition and wisdom has always been as thin as the smoke from a candle. So, let's sit by that fire for a while. The night is long, and the stars outside are still ancient enough to remember everything. This is the story of superstitions that shouldn't have worked, but did, and how those quiet, fearful gestures of the Middle Ages kept whole villages alive without anyone truly knowing why. Now, the first one begins right here, above that cottage door. It's easy to think of iron as ordinary, cold, dull, a little rusty. But in the Middle Ages, it was the most sacredly practical object you could own. People believed iron held the power to drive away evil. They nailed iron horseshoes above doorways, kept small knives beneath pillows, and tucked pins into their clothing to protect against unseen harm. A piece of iron, they said, could make spirits flee and sickness turn aside. Now, if you were to wander into a 14th century cottage, you'd find iron hidden everywhere, in the rafters, in the cradle, sometimes even tied into the hair of livestock. It wasn't just decoration, it was a promise. This home is safe. To a medieval mind, the world was full of invisible creatures, spirits, fairies, demons, even mischievous winds that carried illness. And for reasons no one understood, these unseen things hated iron. The truth, of course, was simpler and stranger. Iron did protect people, just not the way they thought. When blacksmiths forged blades or tools, the process itself, intense heat, smoke, and charcoal, sterilized metal without anyone realizing it. The nails and hinges they made killed bacteria on contact. The smell of the forge, harsh mineral, metallic, repelled flies and fleas that carried real diseases. So, when a villager hung an iron horseshoe above the door, thinking it kept witches away, it was actually keeping out pests. And that old belief that iron stopped spirits from entering your dreams. It turns out, sleeping near iron-rich metal objects or inside iron bed frames can reduce static electricity and grounding disturbances that affect the body's rest. A small, accidental comfort wrapped in a story about devils. Historians still debate whether people noticed the effect consciously or if it was coincidence. But the pattern remained. Iron meant safety, and in a world where few things ever felt safe, that meant everything. Blacksmiths became half saints, half magicians. Their hammers echoed through villages like the heartbeat of protection itself. When a child fell ill, mothers brought small scraps of iron to hang near the cradle. When a storm rose, farmers touched the iron plough for luck before bringing in their animals. Some even believed that a sword placed point first into the ground during a lightning storm could drink the lightning and save the village, which, in a strange way, wasn't completely wrong, because iron does ground electricity. It's science by accident, hidden in faith. In the quiet corners of monasteries, monks wrote about this with curiosity. They noted that the metal of Mars, as they called iron, seemed to protect, strengthen, and heal. They melted small amounts into tonics for anemia without knowing what iron deficiency was. And some monasteries even prescribed drinking water stored in iron pots to restore vital force. They weren't wrong, just early. Over time, that belief in iron's virtue spread far beyond Europe. Across Asia, people carried iron charms to ward off spirits. In Africa, blacksmiths were seen as sacred guardians, and in northern Europe, even the Vikings hung bits of iron near newborns' cradles. Different cultures, same superstition, same unexpected truth. It's comforting to think that somewhere deep inside human instinct, we knew, we sensed what was good for us, even before we could name it. The Middle Ages may look foolish from a distance, but perhaps they were only naming the things our bodies already understood, that metal made by fire held power, that what could survive the forge might just help us survive the night. So, the next time you see a horseshoe above a door, don't laugh. Someone once hung it there to keep evil out, and in a way, they succeeded. In the next part of our story, the air itself becomes sacred, and sound, yes, sound, becomes the weapon against the storm. So, close your eyes a little tighter. Let the world grow quiet again. And when you're ready, we'll listen to the bells. The first sound you'd hear when a storm rolled over a medieval village wasn't thunder, it was bells. When the skies darkened and wind began to stir the thatch, someone, a priest, a sexton, or the oldest man in town, would climb the bell tower and pull the rope with both hands. Clang, clang, clang. The sound would echo over the fields, cutting through rain and distance. It wasn't music, it was defense. They believed the bells could break a storm, that the sound itself frightened away demons, lightning, and hail. The Latin phrase carved on many bell rims read, Fulgura frangzo, I break the lightning. Now, to a modern ear, it sounds naive, as if thunder could be reasoned with. But picture it, a whole village kneeling beneath that noise, children clutching their mothers, livestock trembling in the stables, and the bell, the only thing strong enough to answer the sky. The villagers didn't understand atmospheric pressure or static discharge, but they did know patterns. They noticed that when bells rang, storms sometimes did ease or pass slightly aside. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the ringing simply made people feel safe enough to endure it. Yet the story doesn't end there. Historians now know that bell metal, a mix of copper and tin, produces extremely low frequency sound waves that travel for miles. Those vibrations can disturb the formation of local lightning channels. In other words, the bells didn't chase storms away, but they might have changed the air. There's a darker truth, too. When lightning struck bell towers, as it often did, it killed the very men who believed they were saving their towns. The church eventually forbade bell ringing during storms, but still, many villages ignored the rule. One monk wrote in 1348, "Better to die ringing than watch the fields burn in silence." And perhaps, in a strange way, he was right, because those bell ringers left behind something bigger than science, the memory of courage made sound. Even centuries later, when people began to understand weather, they still built bells for protection. Each bell had a name. Each was baptized with holy water and salt. Some were even said to have stopped plague, war, or crop failure. When you hear a bell today, in a church, or a clock, or even your phone, you're hearing the echo of that faith, the belief that noise itself can hold back the dark. So, when thunder murmurs in the distance and the wind bends the trees, imagine the sound of iron hearts ringing over the hills, not because they could change the storm, but because they could change us. As the storm fades and the world smells again of wet grass and smoke, the villagers return to their hearths, and there, waiting for them, is the most sacred thing of all, bread and salt. Few things in the Middle Ages were more holy than a loaf of bread, and fewer still were as mysterious as a pinch of salt. When a guest entered your home, you offered both, a gesture so simple it became sacred. Bread for nourishment, salt for protection. No one quite remembered why. They just knew it worked. Bread was life itself. It was made from the same fields that fed your family, kneaded with hands that had survived famine, and baked in hearths that had seen births, death, and endless winters. But it was also magic. Villagers believed that bread could absorb curses. A child with fever might be fed the first slice of a fresh loaf to gate away the illness. The heel of bread, when kept overnight on the table, was said to catch wandering spirits that entered at dusk. In the morning, it was thrown to the fire, and the home was safe again. Salt, too, carried power. Small, white, and precious as silver, you sprinkled it before the door to keep away witches. You dropped it in the corners of rooms to trap bad luck. You never, ever spilled it without tossing a pinch over your left shoulder, because that was where the devil waited. It sounds like theatre, doesn't it? But the strange part is, it worked. Salt kills bacteria. It preserves meat, keeps pests away, and purifies water. In an age without refrigeration, salt kept people alive. The ritual of salting everything, from bread to soup to doorsteps, quietly fought infection and food poisoning for centuries. As for bread, its power was more psychological. The comfort of something warm, steady, and human. Breaking bread was the universal act of peace. It calmed tempers, marked truces, and mended trust faster than any priest's sermon. It wasn't just food, it was medicine for the soul. There's a story from a small village in 1292, when a stranger arrived one winter, sick and delirious. The villagers were afraid. They thought he carried the plague. No one dared to approach him except for one old woman. She took a loaf of bread from her hearth, broke it, and placed a bit on his tongue, whispering, "Eat, and the curse will pass you." He lived. They said the bread was blessed, but perhaps it was simpler. She had fed him when no one else would. And kindness, in any century, is its own sort of magic. Salt found its way into every superstition. Sailors carried it on ships to calm the seas. Farmers scattered it over new fields. Even kings required that salt be present at coronation feasts because it symbolized loyalty. What could not rot, could not betray. In many parts of Europe, brides still carry bread and salt to their new homes, not to ward off demons, but to bring prosperity, peace, and good dreams. A ritual so old, no one remembers its first purpose, only that it keeps working. So imagine a candle-lit table in the 14th century, a loaf of bread still warm from the hearth, a small bowl of salt shining like tiny stars, and a family whispering prayers not to gods, but to the simple miracles before them. Bread to sustain, salt to protect, and faith to make the invisible feel close enough to touch. Outside, the wind is still restless, but inside, the air smells of safety, of fire, of flower, of peace. Next, we'll leave the cottage and follow the plague doctor's shadow, because sometimes superstition was the only cure medicine could offer. So breathe softly. The night is still long, and the flowers that saved lives are waiting to bloom. The year is 1348. The summer air hangs thick and still, and Europe has begun to smell of fear. They call it the pestilence. No one knows where it comes from. Some say the stars, some say bad air, Some say God himself, but whatever it is, it kills faster than prayer. Villages fall silent, streets empty. The only sounds are coughs and the wheels of carts carrying the dead. And yet, through that darkness, there is colour. Bundles of herbs tied with twine, little cloth pouches filled with lavender, rose, mint, and wormwood, flowers pressed into every pocket, tucked into sleeves, and scattered over beds like blessings made visible. They called them posies, and, for a superstition, they were strangely effective. Children carried them, monks wore them, even the plague doctors, wrapped in their long black coats and bird-beak masks, stuffed those beaks with dried herbs and petals. People believed the flowers could chase away the bad air, the miasma that carried sickness. They thought if the air smelled sweet, death could not find them. And in a way, they were right. Many of those herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender, thyme, are antibacterial and antiviral. Their oils kill germs on contact. The smoke from burning them purifies air. The superstition that fragrance could shield was an accidental form of medicine. In London, the church blessed great bundles of herbs every Sunday. Women hung them in doorways. Farmers tied them to barn beams, and some even buried them beneath the threshold so that no illness could cross. A rhyme survived from those days. You may have heard it, though you didn't know its origin. Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down. What sounds like a nursery rhyme was once a whispered prayer. Rosy for the red rash of plague, posies for the flowers people carried, ashes for the burning of bodies. Even in death, they found poetry. Historians still debate whether the herbs truly reduced plague infection, but they did reduce lice, pliz, and other carriers, and they gave people something equally powerful, a sense of control. When the world is chaos, belief becomes medicine. The act of doing something, anything, to protect your family becomes its own kind of cure. Imagine the scene: a mother in a cottage, grinding herbs in a small wooden bowl. The light is dim, her hands tremble, but her movements are steady. She fills a pouch, ties it closed, and slips it under her child's pillow. The scent of lavender fills the room. Outside, the world may burn, but here there is still peace. The superstition outlived the plague itself. People still tuck lavender in drawers, still burn sage to cleanse air, still fill their homes with rosemary, the herb of remembrance, because somewhere deep down we remember what it means to turn fear into ritual. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, take one slow breath. The air is sweet, and centuries of prayers still float inside it. But not all superstitions were gentle. Some reached for the stars and tried to cut fate itself. The next one belongs to those who healed with knives and rid the heavens for permission. In a quiet monastery, under a night sky scattered with impossible stars, a monk bends over a parchment chart. He isn't watching the heavens for beauty, he's watching for danger. Tomorrow, a patient is to be bled to release bad humors and restore balance. But the monk won't touch a blade until he knows where the moon is, because in the Middle Ages, you never bled a man when the moon was in the wrong house. Medicine and astrology were the same language then. Physicians believed the human body was a reflection of the cosmos, each organ ruled by a planet, each illness tied to the movement of stars. The heart belonged to the Sunday, the brain to Mercury, the liver to Jupiter, the spleen to Saturn, and the moon. That pale, sleepless eye in the sky ruled the blood. So when the moon waxed or waned, when the constellations shifted, so did the pulse of the world. Before every operation, medieval surgeons consulted lunaria, books that mapped the heavens onto human flesh. They believed cutting into someone under a bad moon could mean death. And sometimes, strangely, they weren't wrong. We now know that the body's fluids, blood, hormones, even mood, follow lunar cycles, tides, fertility, sleep patterns, all subtly linked to that slow orbiting light, operating or traveling during certain lunar phases can influence bleeding, fatigue, and infection. Science, disguised as superstition. In the 12th century, monks of the school of Salerno wrote, "Let the surgeon's knife sleep while the moon is full, for the blood flows too freely beneath her gaze." And so they waited. They watched the stars as carefully as they watched the pulse, and though they spoke in omens instead of equations, they were often astonishingly right. Of course, not everyone believed them. Barbers, for instance, the rough-handed surgeons of the streets, scoffed at lunar charts. They trusted only their razors. But the noble families, the educated ones, would wait for an astrologer's nod before so much as pulling a tooth. Astrology was medicine for the uncertain, and uncertainty was the air people breathed. There's something deeply human about it, isn't there? To look up at the sky and try to make sense of your own pain. To think that maybe, just maybe, the stars are part of your healing. Even now, we still glance upward for answers, checking horoscopes before interviews, tracking moon phases for sleep, lighting candles when logic fails. We're not so different from that monk with the chart. We've just changed the language. As the candle burns lower, our monk rolls away his parchment, and the stars outside shimmer like old glass. He has no microscope, no anesthesia, no sterile gloves, only faith, steady hands, and the patient rhythm of the heavens. Next, we'll descend from the skies back into dreams, where the mind itself became a map of the divine. Close your eyes, traveler. In the next part of our story, you'll see what the medieval world saw when it dreamed. Somewhere between sleep and waking, the medieval mind found a world that felt closer to truth than daylight ever could. Dreams, they believed, weren't just fragments of thought. They were visitations, a place where the soul wandered free and the divine could whisper without being seen. Tonight, you might call it REM sleep. Back then, it was revelation. In monasteries, monks kept dream journals beside their beds, small scraps of parchment filled with sketches of angels, flames, and winding staircases. They called it somnium, the holy vision. A farmer might dream of a white cow and take it as a sign of harvest. A widow might dream of her husband crossing a bridge and know it meant peace at last. Every symbol carried weight. Every shadow meant something. It was a time before Freud or psychology, before science could measure brain waves or sleep cycles. So when dreams spoke, people listened. The church took dreams seriously, sometimes too seriously. They called them ladders to heaven or doors to hell. Saints had prophetic dreams. Kings acted on them. Peasants feared them. The famous scholar Thomas Aquinas once wrote, "Dreams arise from the motion of the stars and the vapors of the stomach alike," which, in its odd way, was true, because medieval people noticed something even we forget. When the body is uneasy, so is the mind. They didn't have sleep studies, but they had centuries of observation. Bad dreams often followed spoiled food, heavy wine, or nights when the wind shifted from the west. And so, to purify sleep, they burned rosemary near the bed, and hung amulets over cradles. It wasn't science, but it wasn't madness either. In a world with so few certainties, dreams became a kind of democracy of the divine. The poor could receive visions as easily as popes, and perhaps that's why the church grew uneasy. By the late Middle Ages, dream interpretation was quietly discouraged. Too many people claimed that God had spoken directly to them. Too many visions that contradicted authority. Still, the practice lived on in secret, in the whispers of midwives, the diaries of nuns, the stories mothers told their children by firelight. If you dream of running water, someone far away is thinking of you. If a candle burns without smoke, an angel is near. And so they built a quiet map of meaning, one dream at a time, a constellation not of stars, but of symbols. It's easy to dismiss that now, to say dreams are random firings of neurons and memory. But listen closely. Modern science agrees that dreams regulate emotion, help us solve problems, and protect our minds from overload. They restore us. So maybe those medieval dreamers weren't wrong after all. Maybe they just gave poetry to the process. And when you dream tonight of falling or flying or walking through some misty village that's half real and half remembered, you'll be sharing something with them, something ancient, something beautifully human. When morning came, the world would wake quietly, guided by more than just dreams, because for the medieval soul, the world itself spoke in the songs of birds and in the tolling of bells. Before alarm clocks, before phone notifications and digital chimes, the medieval world awoke to sound, the toll of the monastery bell, the call of roosters, the caw of crows circling above the fields. To us, it's background noise. To them, it was a language. They believed the world was alive with messages, if you only knew how to listen. Birds, in particular, were considered messengers between realms. A dove at dawn meant peace. An owl near the churchyard meant death. A robin at your window meant a soul was visiting home. Even educated men, doctors, merchants, monks, kept avian calendars, recording which birds appeared when and what omens they carried. It was superstition, yes, but also observation, because birds do predict the weather. They sense changes in air pressure, magnetic fields, and the movements of insects long before humans do. When the swallows flew low, it meant rain. When they vanished entirely, it meant winter. And when the crows gathered, everyone knew to stay close to the fire. Bells, meanwhile, were the heartbeat of the human day. They marked the hours of prayer, the opening of markets, the end of labor. They weren't just timekeepers. They were boundaries between sacred and ordinary, between day and night, between safety and fear. To hear a bell ring was to know you weren't alone. The sound rolled across valleys, settling over farms like a blessing made of metal and air. Even the rhythm of the bells had meaning. A fast peal for weddings, a slow toll for funerals, 3 quick chimes for the Angelus, the moment heaven was thought to touch earth. And if the wind carried the sound far enough, people would pause mid-step, bow their heads, and whisper a single word, peace. Some villages believed certain bells could cure madness. Others said they could scare away storms. When plague struck, churches rang their bells from dawn till dusk, as if sound itself could purify the air. Ironically, they weren't entirely wrong. Sound waves do move air. They break up particles and distribute heat. And that deep, resonant vibration, the one that seems to hum in your chest, lowers heart rate, steadies breath, and calms the nervous system. Which means that when those bells rang, they weren't just praying. They were meditating without knowing it. And the birds, they sang through all of it, through plague and prayer, through markets and funerals. Their songs filled the gaps between bells, a reminder that even in chaos, life continues to make music. The people of the Middle Ages heard meaning in those sounds. We might call it superstition. But maybe it was gratitude. Maybe they simply knew something we've forgotten, that every sound, wind, wings, or bell is a message reminding us we're still alive. The day fades again. The bells go silent. Birds settle into the trees, and the world folds itself back into quiet. In the next part of our story, we'll follow the people who looked not to the skies or the bells, but to the earth, to the soil, the stones, and the bones of the land itself, because even the ground, they believed, could whisper protection. By day, medieval life was ruled by sky, the sun, the moon, the bells, the birds, but by night, it was ruled by the ground. The earth itself was alive to them, not metaphorically, but literally. It breathed, it healed, it remembered, and if you treated it well, it would guard you in return. In every village, there were holy stones. Some marked ancient graves. Some stood alone in meadows, smooth and tall like Fronsin giants. Farmers touched them before planting seed. Mothers laid sick children on them, believing the stone would draw out illness the way the moon draws the tide. A stone kept near the hearth could protect against fire. A pebble carried from a churchyard could shield you from lightning. And if you placed a stone on a grave, it kept the soul from wandering and kept you from dreaming of the dead. Archaeologists call these folk relics, but the truth is, They were part of a deeper rhythm. Stone was permanence in a fragile world. It stood through plague, storm, and empire. To touch stone was to borrow a little of eternity. One record from 1284 tells of a woman in Cornwall who visited an answering rock. She asked a question and laid her ear to the surface. If the stone echoed, the answer was yes. If it stayed silent, the answer was no. It sounds absurd until you remember that many standing stones hum faintly in the wind. The sound is real, the faith that shaped it even more so. There were darker rituals, too. People buried bits of iron, hair, or bread in the ground to trap spirits that haunted them. They called it earth binding. The idea was that restless ghosts could be anchored, given a place to stay. We now know that burying contaminated objects often stopped the spread of disease. They didn't know why it worked, only that it did. In some ways, medieval superstition was simply early public health wearing a mythic mask. Graveyards themselves were protective places. Families picnicked there on holy days. Children played between tombs. It wasn't morbid. It was familiar. They believed the dead kept watch over the living. The soil of a graveyard was thought to ward off storms, and many kept a small pouch of it hidden in their home. To quiet the house, historians still debate whether this was pagan inheritance or Christian adaptation. But either way, the earth was never just dirt. It was memory, condensed and patient. Even today, you can find those same stones, their edges worn soft, their carvings long erased. Tourists pass them without a glance, but listen closely on a quiet evening, and you might still hear what the villagers heard, the low hum of something ancient, a sound too old for words, reminding you that everything ends and everything remains. From stones that whispered, we moved to water that answered, because where earth kept secrets, the wells and springs of Europe were said to speak. Across the countryside, before plumbing, before fountains and taps, there were wells, simple holes in the ground, ringed with stones, cool, damp, echoing, with unseen depths. To medieval people, they weren't utilities, they were portals. Some wells were sacred, others were feared. All were alive. A holy well might cure blindness, fever, or heartbreak. If you drank from it at dawn and left an offering, a black well, meanwhile, was said to swallow those who lied when they looked into its waters. In Ireland, St. Bridget's Well was visited by pilgrims for centuries. They circled it 3 times while whispering wishes, then tied rags to nearby trees, symbols of burdens left behind. The wind, they believed, would carry their troubles away. Not all wells were kind. Some were said to curse anyone who stole their water. In England's Peak District, a tale tells of a farmer who drew water without permission from a holy spring. His crops failed, his cows died, and his house collapsed, leaving only the well standing. The villagers rebuilt their homes around it and began to decorate the well each summer with flowers, hoping to keep it pleased. That ritual, well dressing, still happens in parts of England today. Science gives these stories another meaning. The healing wells often rose through limestone, rich in minerals and antibacterial properties. The cursed ones often ran through iron veins or sulfur beds, water that was unsafe to drink. Over centuries, myth became an early health code. The stories warned where medicine had no words. At the same time, these wells became places of confession. People whispered secrets into the water, believing the earth could hold them safely. A heartache, a sin, a prayer dissolved in reflection. When coins replaced offerings, the tradition survived, a wish thrown into darkness, and the hope of hearing something whisper back. Pilgrims carried water from these wells for protection. Mothers sprinkled it over their children. Sailors took small vials aboard ships, believing one drop could calm the sea. And maybe it could, because belief, carried long enough, becomes power of its own. There's an old saying from Brittany, a blessed well never forgets your name. Perhaps that's why, even now, travelers find comfort kneeling beside them. We throw coins into fountains. We drink miracle mineral water. We bathe in hot springs to heal. The superstition is gone, but the need is the same. So, as you drift towards sleep, imagine the sound of that ancient water trickling through rock and time, carrying prayers and echoes from the people who came before you. They didn't have science, they had stories, and the stories worked. From water, we rise again to the warmth of fire, the flickering heart of every medieval home, because in a world of shadows, the hearth was both an altar and a shield. In the Middle Ages, there was one place in every home that was always warm, always alive, the hearth. It was more than a fireplace. It was the beating heart of the house, the line between safety and the night outside. And to the medieval mind, the hearth wasn't just warmth, it was presence. They believed that every home had a spirit, a quiet, invisible guardian that lived within the flames. Some called it the house saint, others called it the hearth mother, but all agreed, neglect the fire, and your fortune would follow it into darkness. Before bed, families spoke soft words to the flame, not prayers exactly, but something gentler, an acknowledgement, a nightly truce between human and element. They raked the ashes smooth, drew a cross in them with the poker, and whispered, "May this fire sleep as we do, and wake kindly come the dawn." It was superstition, yes, but also habit, wisdom, and survival. A fire left too wild could burn the thatch roof. A fire left too cold could freeze a family before morning. Faith, in this case, was also good housekeeping. In Scotland and Ireland, they practiced smoring the fire, a ritual of gently covering the embers to keep them glowing overnight. Each family had its own charm for it. Half prayer, half lullaby, I s'more this fire, as the sun smored the sea, with the milk of Mary and the breath of God, by the dim red light of dying coals. The home felt safe, as if the boundary between worlds had closed for the night. The hearth was also where the sacred and the mundane blurred together. Births happened beside it. So did death vigils. Bread baked, there was blessed without words. It was said that if you stared into the flames too long, you might glimpse a face, a spirit passing by, or a reflection of someone soon to arrive. The fire became an oracle, and its smoke a messenger. Historians still debate whether these traditions came from pagan roots or early Christian adaptation, but perhaps they were both. The human instinct to sanctify warmth itself, even in monasteries where austerity ruled, a single fire was often kept in the infirmary through the night. The monks called it the living mercy, not for comfort, but because it reminded them that sunlight must always remain, even when faith faltered. So when you imagine the medieval night, don't picture only darkness. Picture embers, red as heartbeat, steady as breath, a whole civilization asleep beside its guardian flame. But the fire was never only gentle. It was both protector and destroyer, a blessing that could turn into judgment without warning. The same element that cooked your bread could also burn your sins. And in that paradox, people saw the divine. To the medieval mind, fire was the most mysterious of all elements, a living contradiction. It gave life, and it took it. It illuminated holy texts and devoured heretics. They said it belonged to God, but could be borrowed by man if you treated it with respect. Villagers carried embers from one year to the next, believing that fire had ancestry, that each spark descended from the last like bloodlines. When a hearth went cold, they borrowed coals from a neighbor. To refuse was unthinkable. It was like denying someone breath. On Easter, churches extinguished all flames, then relit them from a single blessed fire, a rebirth in miniature. From that sacred spark, families rekindled their home hearths, carrying candles through the night, as though bearing a newborn light through the womb of darkness. It was symbolic, but also practical. It united entire towns under one shared flame, reminding them that warmth was not owned but shared. There were other fires too, fires for cleansing, for sacrifice, for justice. When illness struck, people smoked homes with herbs. When crops failed, they leapt over bonfires for luck. And when suspicion rose, fire was asked to decide. The ordeal by fire, they called it. If your skin blistered quickly, you were guilty. If it healed clean, you were innocent. It sounds barbaric now, but to them, it was proof that fire belonged to the divine. No human could fake its judgment. Historians still debate whether priests believed in these trials or simply used them to keep order. But the faith behind it was absolute. There's something deeply human about that contradiction, isn't there? We still light candles to remember, yet fear what the flame could do. We still stare into campfires, half mesmerized, half afraid. The medieval world simply put that tension into ritual. They didn't separate fire's warmth from its warning. They lived in balance with it, a daily truce between awe and caution. One curious custom still lingers. When lightning struck a home, people didn't rebuild immediately. They lit a candle instead, a thunder candle, and let it burn for 3 nights before re-entering. They believed the flame would speak to the air, soothing the storm's spirit and asking it not to return. Modern science would call it atmospheric discharge, but the villagers called it peace. As night deepens in our story, the hearth's glow softens, the embers fade, and in the silence that follows, people turn back to the sky, to the stars that watched over every superstition, every charm, every prayer ever whispered in fear and wonder, because while fire bound them to the earth, the stars reminded them there was something beyond it. In the next part of our journey, we rise from the hearth to the heavens, to the monks who mapped constellations by candlelight, and to the belief that fate itself was written in the stars. There's a certain kind of silence that only existed in the Middle Ages, a silence so deep you could hear the stars breathe in monasteries scattered across Europe long before telescopes or electricity. Monks kept vigil not just in prayer, but in observation. Their nights were devoted to the heavens. While the world slept, they measured the movements of light. They weren't called astronomers yet. They were keepers of time. The medieval church governed every hour of the day, the bells for matins, prime, vespers. But someone had to know when those hours began. So the monks became watchers of the cosmos. They tracked sunrise and solstice, moonrise and equinox, and slowly, through candle smoke and frost, they realized the sky had patterns. It wasn't divine chaos, it was divine order. Somewhere between devotion and discovery, religion gave birth to astronomy. In the Abbey of Cluny, in France, monks built one of the first mechanical clocks, a machine to imitate the rhythm of the stars. In Canterbury, England, records show brothers rising before dawn to mark the moon's position and compare it to the chants of the Psalms. They believed light itself carried messages, each star a syllable in God's speech, each comet a warning, each eclipse a reminder that heaven could close its eyes. One monk, Roger Bacon, wrote that the stars sing in silence, and that by studying their movements, one could read the mind of the Almighty. Historians still debate whether he meant that literally, or whether he was just tired and poetic after too many sleepless nights. But what's remarkable is this: while superstition told peasants to fear the night, these monks learned to love it. They transformed darkness into a book and the stars into ink. Out in the fields, farmers also followed the sky. The shepherd's calendar told them when to sow and harvest. If the moon was high and bright, they said the milk would come rich. If it hung red and low, storms were near. The church called these old beliefs folk errors, yet the same monks who condemned them quietly used the same stars to set their prayer hours. Faith and reason, superstition and science, they coexisted, not as rivals, but as neighbors. And perhaps that's why medieval Europe endured so long, because even when reason slept, someone kept watching the sky. But for those who couldn't read Latin or charts, there were others who could read the body instead, not from books, but from stars. They were called zodiac healers, and they believed every illness was written in the heavens. If you fell sick in the 12th century, you didn't always call a doctor. You might call an astrologer. They didn't wear robes of mystery or mutter in strange tongues. They wore ink-stained fingers and carried charts. Their work looked mathematical, almost modern, but beneath the geometry lay something ancient, a belief that the human body was the mirror of the sky. Every part of you, they said, was ruled by a constellation. Aries ruled the head, Taurus, the neck, Cancer, the chest, Virgo, the belly, Pisces, the feet. To touch one was to touch its star. To heal one was to realign it. So, before performing a treatment, from bleeding to herbal medicine, these healers consulted the heavens. They studied birth charts, planetary alignments, lunar phases. If Mars was rising, avoid cutting too much blood. If Venus shone bright, start remedies for love and fertility. If Saturn was heavy, guard against melancholy. Strange, maybe, but centuries later, science caught up in subtle ways. We now know that tides, hormones, and even mood are influenced by lunar cycles, that circadian rhythms, the body's clock, mirror planetary movement, that the calcium in your bones was forged inside collapsing stars. So when medieval healers said you were written in the sky, they weren't entirely wrong. They just spoke in metaphor before we had microscopes. In some monasteries, physicians and astrologers were the same person. They used zodiac man charts, beautiful drawings of a human body mapped with signs of the zodiac. Patients were treated according to their sign and ailment. It wasn't random mysticism. It was data, their version of it. Centuries of pattern and observation turned into belief. When certain ailments returned with the same moon, they noticed. When a fever broke after certain prayers, they recorded it. Over time, the pattern hardened into practice. One medieval manuscript tells of a healer who refused to treat patients on nights when Mars glared. When asked why, he said, "It is not the man I fear, but the hour." To him, healing wasn't only physical, it was temporal. The wrong time could kill a cure. And so they watch the sky like doctors watch monitors. For every diagnosis, a constellation. For every remedy, a star. Today, we might call it superstition, but it came from the same impulse that drives science now to find connection, to make sense of suffering, to believe that the world is not chaos. And maybe that's the point. Science and superstition are siblings, born of the same wonder, one measuring, the other imagining. The healers look up. The night grows quiet. The stars shimmer faintly in the monastery's pool. But below the heavens, another form of magic was stirring, one not found in sky or scripture, but in the hands of ordinary people. Next, we descend again, back to earth, to the hidden corners of daily life, where charms, colors, and humble gestures quietly shaped survival. Not every miracle came from priests or stars. Some came from hands. In the Middle Ages, touch was its own kind of medicine. People believed that a steady hand, a loving hand, could drive out sickness, soothe pain, even mend bones, and in ways no one then could measure. They were right. Every village had its wise woman or cunning man, not doctors in the modern sense, but healers who used herbs, charms, and touch. They pressed their palms to fevers, traced crosses over wounds, and whispered words older than the church itself. These were people who believed that sickness was not only physical, it was spiritual, emotional, even environmental. If your child was wasting away, they didn't ask what he had. They asked what had changed. Was there a quarrel in the house? A cold draught from the window? A restless ancestor? Medicine and magic blurred like candlelight and smoke. One superstition said that the seventh son of a seventh son could heal with a touch. Kings of England even claimed this gift, laying their hands upon the sick in great public ceremonies. They called it the royal touch. Crowds came from miles away, believing the king's blood carried divine grace. And whether through faith, adrenaline, or sheer hope, many did feel better. Even now, science recognizes that touch releases oxytocin, lowers stress hormones, and strengthens the immune system. A superstition, perhaps, but one with a pulse. In smaller homes, healing was intimate. Mothers rubbed garlic on children's feet to draw out colds. Wives tied red wool around their husbands' wrists to ward off fatigue. Neighbors held hands in silence when words failed. Sometimes all the magic was love disguised as ritual, and that was enough. There's an old folk charm from Wales that goes, "Lay thy hand where the heart doth beat, whisper thrice, and pain retreats." It probably did nothing, and yet in that simple act there was tenderness, attention, and belief, 3 ingredients as old as healing itself. Historians still debate whether the cunning folk were early psychologists, herbalists, or simply storytellers, but their success rate was undeniable, because the first step in healing, then and now, is being seen. Even in monasteries, monks practiced touch. They washed the feet of strangers. They laid hands upon the dying. They believed that God worked through contact, and that skin was not a barrier to holiness, but a bridge. Perhaps that's the truest magic of all. Connection, a superstition that has outlived every empire, but not every kind of power was touched. Some was worn. Colors, fabrics, and stitches carried meaning, and the wrong thread could curse you as surely as a poisoned cup. In a world before mass production, clothing was more than fashion. It was protection, a portable spell. Every color, every fiber carried power. Red, for instance, was life itself. It symbolized blood, passion, survival. Women wore red ribbons in childbirth to strengthen the heart. Knights tied red sashes around their waists before battle. It wasn't just for luck. It was psychology before psychology. The color made them feel unstoppable. Blue was sacred, the color of the Virgin Mary's robe. A peasant woman might dye her shawl blue before winter, believing it would guard her from sorrow. Blue meant divine favor, and cloth traders often mixed in expensive indigo just to meet demand from the devout. Green, though, was dangerous, the color of fairies, jealousy, and decay. Only fools and the brave wore it too boldly. They said green cloth carried the conquite. restless luck that never stayed long. Historians still debate whether this came from pagan tree worship or simple dye chemistry, since the copper-based greens of the era often caused rashes and illness, a superstition born from science, once again disguised as myth. In towns, tailors were part craftsman, part conjurer. People believed they could sue in fortune. When a new garment was made, a hidden stitch or knot might be left near the collar, a secret charm only the wearer knew. Weddings had their own rules. A blue hem for faith, a red thread for love, a silver pin for protection from envy, and in some regions, clothes of the dead were never burned or reused for fear the soul would return, searching for what was lost. But cloth could also free you. When monks abandoned worldly life, they took vows of habit, literally, clothing as commitment. The simple wool robe was a surrender of vanity, a quiet armor of humility. It's easy to miss now, but even in simplicity, there was symbolism. The color brown, the earth itself, was chosen to remind them that all things return to dust, that everything, even silk and gold, ends in silence. Sometimes, though color rebelled, during festivals, towns erupted into chaos. Men wore their wives' dresses, servants dressed as lords. The world turned itself inside out for a night. They called it the Feast of Fools. Bright scarves flew, bells jingled, and the church frowned, but tolerated it, because even superstition needs release. In those fabrics, in those hidden threads, you can still trace the story of survival, a belief that if the world couldn't be controlled, at least it could be dressed. And maybe that's why we still wear lucky colors, still choose certain clothes for comfort, still keep an old shirt we can't quite throw away, because the medieval people weren't wrong. Objects carry memory, and sometimes memory is magic. The candlelight flickers across wool and linen. Outside, the night deepens, but inside, there's warmth, color, and quiet protection. Next, we turn to the strange creatures who shared this world with humanity, the animals who were both feared and beloved, omens and companions, symbols of luck and warning. The medieval world was never truly alone. Even in silence, it was watched. Eyes in the hedgerows, wings over rooftops, fur brushing through the night. Animals were not just creatures, they were messengers, symbols, and sometimes warnings. To modern minds, it might seem like superstition, but to medieval hearts, it was the language of the earth itself. Cats, for example, in the Middle Ages, they were both revered and reviled, creatures of contradiction, like fire. In monasteries, cats kept libraries free from rats and mice. They were considered protectors of sacred parchment, and many monks wrote affectionate notes about their feline companions. One 9th century poem survives from an Irish scribe. I and Pangur Ban, my cat, each has his trade and art. His is hunting mice, mine is hunting words. But outside the cloister walls, cats grew darker reputations. Black cats, especially, were said to walk with witches, to whisper secrets in the night. to cross paths with omens. It wasn't fair, but it was powerful, because the cat's mystery mirrored life itself, aloof, unpredictable, impossible to control, and people feared what they couldn't command. Crows were much the same, prophets dressed in feathers. A single crow near your door could mean news was coming. 2 meant sorrow. 3 meant change. 4, a journey. Superstition, yes, but crows are astonishingly intelligent. They can recognize faces, mimic voices, and remember kindness or cruelty for years. In a world where word of mouth was everything, the idea that birds carried news wasn't entirely wrong. Dogs were symbols of loyalty and luck. To dream of a dog was to dream of faithfulness. To be followed by one was an honor, but a howling dog outside your window was thought to sense death, perhaps a remnant of their uncanny ability to detect illness and change in the body's scent. Pigs were prosperity, owls wisdom or witchcraft, depending on who you asked. Frogs were feared, yet kept near wells for good fortune, and bees, bees, were sacred. They were thought to have souls. If a family member died, you had to tell the bees, or they would abandon their hives in grief. It sounds fanciful, but bees do respond to vibrations of voice and emotion. Maybe they really could sense loss. The church often tried to suppress such beliefs, but never quite succeeded, because to the people of the Middle Ages, animals weren't beneath them. They were beside them, living proof that the world was alive, connected, and sometimes compassionate. Even now, we keep fragments of that bond in our pets, our symbols, our superstitions. A paw, a feather, a lucky charm, reminders that once upon a time we trusted the creatures who shared our silence. But animals weren't the only beings with power. The forest itself breathed with its own kind of soul, ancient, patient, and unpredictable. The villagers called it the green faith, and it was older than any church. Before cities, before cathedrals, there were forests, vast, dark cathedrals of their own. To medieval people, trees were more than wood and leaves. They were living witnesses. They saw births, wars, oaths, and betrayals, and remembered all of it. Every forest was sacred, and every tree had a name. The oak was the king, strong, unyielding, a symbol of endurance. It was said that lightning struck oaks more often because the gods preferred to speak through them. When storms passed, villagers gathered the splinters and carried them home for protection. The ash was a healer. A child's fever could be cured, it was said, by passing them through a split ash tree 3 times at sunrise. Historians still debate whether this was pagan ritual or coincidence, but the image is unforgettable. A tree, a sunrise, a mother's hope. The yew was older than death. It grew in graveyards, its roots feeding on memory, its shadow set to open a doorway between worlds. That's why medieval churches were built beside ancient yews, not to bless the trees, but to borrow their power. And then there were the fairy trees, lawn hawthorns or rowans standing in the middle of fields. No farmer dared cut them down. To harm one was to invite disaster. Plagues, storms, even infertility, all blamed on broken pacts with the unseen. The truth, however, was simpler. Those trees provided vital shelter for birds and bees, prevented soil erosion, and marked ancient property lines. What superstition called sacred, science now calls ecological wisdom. People left offerings at the roots, coins, bread, milk, ribbons, not for worship, but gratitude. They believed the trees watched over their homes, and in return, they watched over the trees. One 14th century traveller wrote, "The people of Wales do not pray to trees, but they speak to them, for trees, too, are made by God and remember His breath." It's easy to smile at that until you walk alone through a forest and feel the air grow thicker as though something ancient is listening. The church eventually declared the practice heretical, but could never root it out completely. Even priests tied ribbons on trees near their parishes. Faith, it seemed, was large enough to hold contradictions. And maybe that's the lesson. The green faith never truly disappeared. It was absorbed, transformed, whispered into the prayers of those who still tended land with reverence. So tonight, if you dream of forests, if you hear leaves moving in the dark, don't be afraid. That's not superstition. That's memory. The same hush that held the world long before we spoke its name. Now the forest quiets, the night deepens, and somewhere in a small stone village, a candle flickers beside a window. Inside, a family prays, not to trees or stars or beasts, but to something that lives in all of them, the mystery of belief itself. By the late Middle Ages, superstition wasn't just belief anymore. It was muscle memory. People no longer wondered why they hung herbs by the door or crossed themselves before drinking water from a stream. They simply did it. Faith had woven itself into every gesture. The sacred and the ordinary were no longer separate. To live, then, was to move through a world alive with meaning. Every creak of the floorboard was a spirit shifting. Every cough had a cause beyond the physical. And every dawn, even the greyest, was a small resurrection. You could not escape belief, and you would not have wanted to, because superstition, for all its oddities, offered something logic never could: comfort. There was comfort in the daily rhythm, in lighting the candle, in blessing the bread, in whispering protection over a sleeping child. Even doubt had its rituals. A man uncertain of his faith might still pause before an old shrine, or mutter a charm taught by his grandmother, just in case. And who could blame him when life was short and uncertain? A whispered charm was a small rebellion against chaos. In a sense, superstition was the medieval form of mindfulness. Each act, touching wood, tossing salt, teeing a ribbon, brought attention to the moment, anchored fear in ritual, and turned survival into ceremony. Historians still debate whether these gestures were religion or psychology, but perhaps they were both, because human beings have always needed stories to make sense of what hurts. Even kings surrounded by gold and scholars, kept charms beneath their pillows. Even monks, sworn to faith, carved protective symbols into the margins of their prayer books. The more the world modernized, the more quietly superstition endured, not as defiance, but as memory. And now, centuries later, we still live with their echoes. We knock on wood, hang horseshoes, cross our fingers, make wishes at 11:11. We call them habits, but once they were spells. And so the story winds down, from gods to ghosts, from reason to ritual, until all that remains is the faint glow of a candle in the dark. The world that once believed in everything begins to dream. The candle is nearly gone now. Its flame trembles, a thin thread of gold against the cool air. Outside, the village sleeps. The fields are silvered by moonlight. Somewhere, a bell tolls the hour, slow, patient, like the breathing of the world. Inside, the house is still. The herbs by the door hang motionless. The cat curls by the fire, and in the half-dark, the air smells faintly of smoke and lavender. It's easy to imagine that nothing has changed, that we are still those same humans, resting beside our small, flickering lights, wondering what unseen things guard or guide us. We no longer fear fairies or cursed wells. We no longer believe that dreams predict the weather. And yet, we still search for signs, for luck, for meaning in coincidence, for hope in ritual. Maybe that's what superstition really is. The poetry of survival, a way of turning fear into form and mystery into memory. Because even now, in this modern world of reason and light, we still make the same wish before sleep, that tomorrow will come kindly, and that something somewhere is listening. The candle gutters once, then steadies. The walls are soft with shadow. The fire hums like a distant heart, and for a moment you can almost hear the voices of those who came before you, murmuring charms, whispering prayers, breathing the same air, watching the same stars. They are gone, and yet not gone. Their faith lingers in gestures we no longer question. Their hope lives in every quiet ritual we perform without thinking. So, close your eyes now. Let the past fade like smoke. The night has done its work. The world is safe again. And somewhere in the dark, the last superstition burns gently, not as fear, but as light. If you've drifted off, may your dreams be kind. If you're still awake, thank you for keeping the candle burning.